With Bucky Barnes now confirmed to be joining the Thunderbolts as part of Phase 5, the Winter Soldier will make a couple more new friends. And while Bucky experiences a new chapter in his life, nothing can beat the dynamic friendship between him and Steve Rogers. Steve and Bucky had one of the strongest friendships in the MCU that stemmed back to the 1940s when they always had each other's backs on either date or fighting battle. Though they hit a few bums in the road in the modern era, particularly with Hydra, the power of friendship always prevailed. Many MCU fans were engrossed by their robust bonding and did not miss an opportunity to create memes about them. Always choosing Bucky no matter who, while Steve was always willing to forgive Bucky for his crimes as the Winter Soldier, that unconditional support sometimes became ridiculous from an outside perspective. After all, trying to bond with a Hydra assassin in front of a man personally wronged by him was a questionable choice. But still, by standing beside Bucky in the wake of the revelation that he killed Tony's parents, Steve proved just how much Bucky's friendship meant to him. He wouldn't sacrifice it for anything, even Tony. It's why Steve and Bucky were the best MCU couple. The second pick for the Shield. While Steve offered his shield to Sam Wilson rather than Bucky, it was clear that Bucky was also a potential option. Head carried the shield before he was the Winter Soldier, and he had an almost identical serum running through his veins as the one that made Steve into a superhero. In the end, it was also clear why the shield went to Sam instead. Bucky was a veritable war criminal, and having him bear the mantle would have been almost as publicly disastrous as having John Walker wear it. Bucky and Steve understood that, which is why it never became an issue between them. Plus, Sam deserved it, given his loyalty to Steve in their short period together. Choosing love over friendship. While Bucky was often by Steve's side on the battlefield, Steve always preferred the presence of his dance partner rather than his war buddy. Therefore, it led Steve to travel back in time to be at Peggy Carter's side, while Bucky was left in the present to deal with the aftermath. After everything they had been through, it was terrible for Bucky to watch his friend go, but he still took it with grace. He may have been the second pick twice in the same day, but he cared enough about Steve that he didn't mind. After all, Steve got his happy ending, even if Bucky never could. Bucky is still hurt inside. Steve and Bucky had a friendship that was meant to last to the end of the line. While there were moments when they fell off the tracks, both always managed to crawl back into the train and keep going. At least, this lasted until Steve went back in time and left Bucky alone. It's easy to sum up Bucky Barnes as a character who wants the best for his friends, but losing Steve clearly hurt him deeply. While he tended to be alone even when Steve was in the present with him, he was completely and utterly alone once his best friend was gone. So while he pretended to be okay, it was clear that he wasn't. Would risk everything for each other. After refusing to sign the Sokovia Accords, Steve Rogers put himself in harm's way in a desperate attempt to keep his best friend safe from unfair prosecution. After all, his time as an assassin meant that Bucky had few friends and many enemies, and Steve cared so much that he was willing to throw away everything for his friend. Steve's refusal to sign the Accords and rejoin the Avengers didn't just make him a captain without a home. In fact, it meant that the Avengers were completely separated for years, which is why they weren't fully prepared for the Thanos invasion. Steve risked the world to keep Bucky safe, and it shows just how much he cared. Temporarily forgotten, Steve and Bucky had one of the strongest friendships in the MCU before Bucky fell off that train, and that was why it was so devastating for Steve to be reunited with a man who did not recognize him at all. Decades of brainwashing and isolation had left Bucky in an entirely amnesiac state. Still, Steve never gave up on Bucky. Though he was clearly hurt by Bucky's tragic time as the Winter Soldier, he was still determined to see him free and safe. That's why Steve was willing to let Bucky kill him. He cared too much, and he was willing to risk the world to get Bucky to remember him. Couldn't last forever. Bucky and Steve always promised each other they would be there until the end of the line. Unfortunately, that end came much sooner than they ever could have expected. Despite the circumstances that led them to the future and eventually reunited, Steve found a way to go back, and Bucky didn't. Left behind, Bucky was forced to try to make it in the world alone, which eventually led him to become one of Sam's best friends in the MCU. Yet, without his real best friend at his side, Bucky was as listless as he was hurt, and it was because Steve couldn't handle the present world anymore, even with Bucky there. Old friends fighting against each other. Steve and Bucky were close friends from the start, but that doesn't mean that they haven't had their fair share of conflicts. Though they most often fight alongside one another, Bucky's status as the Winter Soldier meant that he had forgotten everything about Steve, and that had some violent results. Of course, it didn't last. While alternate versions of Bucky Barnes, who had not met Steve again, would still be prowling the world and assassinating key figures, his friendship with Steve softened him. No longer is he a remorseless killer who fights at the first opportunity. Instead, Hess returned to his natural self, and the world is all the safer for it. Defend each other at all costs. Steve and Bucky have always been protective over each other. When the two were still young, Bucky was the figure who helped save Steve from fights and pull him out of anything stupid he might try. But once the two were pulled into the future, it was Steve's turn to protect his friend. Despite being a close friend to Tony, Steve covered up the Winter Soldier's involvement in the deaths of the Stark parents. Even worse, the Honorable Steve lied through his teeth about it. It goes to show just how far Steve was willing to go to make sure his best friend was safe, to the point of jeopardizing other friendships. Steve never listens to Bucky as much as Bucky always wanted to keep Steve safe. It never completely worked out. Even when he was shipping off to serve in World War II, he warned Steve to avoid doing anything stupid. The next time they met, Steve had a superhuman serum in his system and was single-handedly infiltrating a Hydra prison camp. So, while the two clearly respected one another, Steve was never actually willing to listen to anything Bucky told him. The kid from Brooklyn just wasn't ready to sit by and let other people save the day, especially when it was his friend desperately in need of help. Steve risked everything to save Bucky, and he